Okay, hello and welcome one and all to the SCCJR Annual Lecture 2020. I'm Ali Fraser, Director of SCCJR. I'm about to hand you over to my colleague Fergus McNeill to get proceedings started, but just before that, I wanted to offer a warm Scottish welcome to friends and colleagues near and far. One of the very few silver linings of lockdown is that we're able to bring together a huge range of people under our virtual roof, and it's fantastic to have you all here with us today. Now, I know what you're all thinking. I know because it's probably the question I get asked the most, enough that I would remark on it. It's, what does SCCJR actually stand for? And how many C's are there again? SCCJR? Well, my answer is always the same. What does SCCJR stand for? Well, it's short for the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, but it stands for so much more. We're based in Scotland, but very international. It's a centre, but it's decentered between 4 universities and beyond. It's about crime and justice, but just as urgently about harm and injustice. And yes, we research. We research like our wee hearts depend on it. Research that is informed by theory, diverse in method, engaged in policy and practice, creative in its approach, proper research. But we also talk, teach, listen, learn. How many C's are there? Well, there are 2, but maybe we should add a few more. The Scottish Centre for Critical, Creative, Curious, Collaborative, Collegial, Comparative, Connected, and Communitarian Justice Research. That's 9. 2020 has been an incredibly tough year, but I'm very proud of how we as a community have come together and helped one another through. I wanted to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Sarah Armstrong, the previous director, whose shoes I naively and unsuspectingly stepped into a million years ago back in January, to the management committee for their unwavering help and support, and most of all to Rachel Cabane, who most of you will know from emails and Eventbrite, who is our media and communications officer, but more recently has become a podcast producer, Zoom tech supremo, and all-round troubleshooter. Thank you, Rachel, for all you do. Anyway, you don't want to be hearing from me and my lists of words starting with the letter C. You want to be learning from the cutting edge, hot off the press scholarship of our esteemed friend, Reuben Jonathan Miller, who will be talking about his much anticipated book, Halfway Home. As the grumbling machine of US politics grinds on, Dr. Miller's research reminds us of the very specific impacts of the wide-ranging social inequalities that exist in the United States, both before and during the era of a certain well-known Scottish golf course owner. What happens next in the era of the Bidey Inn? Well, perhaps that's one for Dr. Miller. Now, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Fergus McNeill to offer a proper introduction to our guest, but just before I do, if you want to learn more about SCCJR, check out our website, sccjr.ac.uk, follow us on Twitter at the SCCJR, and subscribe to our mailing lists. We have teaching resources, podcasts, webinars, blogs, and more research reports than you can shake a stick at. Over to you, Fergus. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ali, and welcome everybody to the lecture this year. It's extremely exciting to be here and to be able to welcome Reuben in a moment. Before I do that, I'll talk you through the process. So Reuben's going to talk for about 40 minutes or so about some of the material in his forthcoming book, as Ali mentioned. Then the Centre's own Marguerite Schinkel will respond, Marguerite being a researcher who works in very similar areas in relation to people's experiences of imprisonment and release. After both of them have spoken, we'll open the floor to Q&A, but because of the numbers involved today, we're having to do that through the chat function, not the chat function, but the little Q&A at the bottom of your screen, which you should be able to see on the bar at the bottom. So at any point in Reuben's talk or in Marguerite's response, feel free to enter comments there, questions there. My job will be to try to moderate those comments, keep an eye on them, and then put questions to Ruben at the end. And we'll aim to have everything wrapped up by 4:30. So let me just briefly introduce Ruben and then hand over to him. I first met Ruben, I think in 2012 at the American Criminology Conference in Chicago, and we spent the day together traveling around halfway houses, re-entry projects in Chicago's West Side. And it was a fascinating day, both because of what we were doing and where we were going and what we were seeing, but also a fascinating day because we engaged in wonderful conversations, rich, both because of what Ruben had been doing and observing over the preceding years, and because of what he had read and studied. And when we tried to compare notes about our research and life experiences in Scotland and in the USA, we found a lot in common and a lot that was different. And I'm sure that hearing from Ruben today is going to be as enriching for all of you as it was for me on that first occasion. To do the formal thing, Ruben is a sociologist, criminologist, and a social worker who teaches at the University of Chicago in the School of Social Service Administration. He's also a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture in the University of Chicago. Ruben studies and writes about race, democracy, and the social life of the city. He has done fieldwork in Chicago, Detroit, and New York, but also in Glasgow and in Belgrade. And his research has been published widely. Ruben is a member at has been a member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, a fellow at the New America and the Rockefeller Foundations, and a visiting scholar at the University of Texas at Austin and Dartmouth College. He is a native son of Chicago, a proud one. He lives with his wife and children on the city's south side. Today, he's going to share findings from his forthcoming book, Halfway Home: Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration, which will be published by Little Brown and Company in February. So over to you, Ruben. Welcome.
Fergus, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's good to be with you. It's such an honor. And also, I'm just glad for our now years of friendship. It's funny. You're an old friend of mine now, which is lovely. Thank you to Professor Alistair Fraser for the lovely invitation and for teeing up this discussion and for the great jokes this morning. And to Professor McNeil, who I mentioned, the chair of this talk, and my host and dear friend, and to Professor Marguerite Schinkel, who will offer a response to this talk, and to my friends at the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research and in the Department of Sociology. It's been too long since I've last had the chance to visit face-to-face, and I look forward to coming back. And thank you for having me. I'm honored to give this lecture and look forward to more exchange over the years. And finally, thank you to you, to the attendees. You could be doing other things right now, but you're spending this time with us, and you've come to my talk, and I deeply appreciate it. This morning, I want to talk about mass incarceration. And just sharing my screen, hold one second. Okay. And then, so, this morning I want to talk, I'm sorry, it's afternoon for you, it's morning for me, it's 9 o'clock. But so I want to talk about mass incarceration's afterlife. And about the journey home and what it involves. I want to talk about what I call a supervised society. And this is a society that we've erected through our laws and our policies. And the premise is simple. We must reimagine the problem if we're ever to change it. Let's begin with how we think about the problem. We'll borrow insight from two of my heroes. The first is James Baldwin, the second, Nina Simone. Beginning with Baldwin. The year is 1965. It's October. Baldwin is famously debating William F. Buckley, a man called the, quote, father of American conservatism. He's at the storied Oxford Debate Society. The resolution: the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. The entire debate is on YouTube if you want to check it out. Baldwin, of course, wins. This is because James Baldwin always wins. You can't lose if you're James Baldwin. The resolve: yes, of course, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. And there was an expense. There were costs involved. And those costs go far beyond the practices of slavery. Of course, there was stolen labor. Slave labor is necessarily stolen. And of course, there was exploitation. But really, the question itself was absurd. It was 1965. We had a Voting Rights Act and voter intimidation, a Jim Crow South and redlining in the North. Whiteness, Baldwin said, was sustained through Black suffering. And in one of his most memorable lines in the debate, he reminded us of the Black condition. Now, he says, leaving aside all the physical factors one can quote, leaving aside the rape or murder, leaving aside the, quote, bloody catalog of oppression, which we are too familiar with anyway, he says, what the system does to the subjugated is destroy his sense of reality. In the case of the American Negro, from the moment you were born, every stick and stone, every face is white, he says. Since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose you are white too. It comes as a great shock, he says, around the age of 5 or 6 or 7, to discover that the flag to which you have pledged your allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. To see Gary Cooper, and Gary Cooper was a famous hero, a famous movie star, killing off all the Indians. And although you were rooting for Gary Cooper, the Indians are you. This is Baldwin being Baldwin. William F. Buckley simply didn't have a chance. He was overmatched. And many others, I and many others, think that Baldwin's mind is exquisite. But I found the very next passage particularly striking. He says, it comes as a great shock to discover that the country to which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The dissatisfaction and the gap between people only on the basis of their skins begins there and accelerates throughout your whole lifetime. You realize that you are 30 and you're having a terrible time. You've been through a certain kind of mill, he says. And the most serious effects is, again, not the, quote, catalog of disaster, the policeman, the taxi driver, the waiters, the landlady, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours out of every day spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It's not that. By the time you have begun to see it happening in your daughter, your son, or your niece, or your nephew, you are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you escape the trap, he says. But what is worse is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from having the same disaster and from coming to the same end. The next hero is Nina Simone. It's 1962. Miss Simone sits at a piano for a live recording of Centerman at the Village Gate nightclub in New York City. Moaning in the break, the drum and hand clap driving the beat, each keystroke expresses the urgency of the moment. Simone is slender and striking in a white sleeveless gown. Her features feel more pronounced, her gaze focused, sometimes intense, sometimes directed toward the keys, sometimes toward her or her band or her audience, her voice full, deep, a compliment to the series of jangling but precise chords that she strums. Oh yeah, she sings. Oh yeah, her voice trailing, now accompanying the chords she plays with an intensity that's directed at no one in particular, but feels as if it's directed at you. She begins again, her audience on edge. This time the pitch is a bit higher. Oh yeah, she sings. Now back to the keys, the sound and tempo build. Miss Simone begins. Oh, Centerman, where you gonna run to? Centerman, where you gonna run to? Where you gonna run to on that day? This song was recorded in 1962, 3 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Medgar Evers had not yet been assassinated in the driveway coming home from the NAACP meeting. 14-year-old Addie Mae Collins, 14-year-old Carol Denise McNair, 14-year-old Carol Rosman Robertson, and 16-year-old Cynthia Wesley would not yet be blown to bits by a white supremacist at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, nicknamed Bombingham, Alabama. The same bomber did not yet murder Johnny Robertson, or Virgil Ware had not yet died on that same day at the hands of police. They had not yet been lost to history either. But Black life was no easier in 1962 than it was in 1963, when more people paid attention. And it was no easier in Birmingham than it had been in Harlem, New York, or Bronzeville in my hometown of Chicago. Where will Sinner Man run and hide to escape the judgment that is all around him? He has sinned, which is to say he has amassed a debt. He must repay it. Les Baxter recorded a show tune cover of this song a decade before, where the Sinner Man in his song runs to the moon. But this is a Negro spiritual, one that has been sung in Black churches since the turn of the 20th century and whose roots run much deeper. It is a song that should be sung with a tambourine, a warning and a call to prayer to get right so the church can go home. And the debt is a real one. The philosopher and polemicist Friedrich Nietzsche tells us that the origin of guilt, what he calls bad conscience, comes from the material relationship between a lender and a debtor. The debtor, should he fail to pay what he owes, offers the lender his very flesh, or the flesh of his wife, or the flesh of his child to do with as he will. It is a sign of his free will to offer the one thing over which he has mastery, his body. The lender takes pleasure in torturing the debtor, and at the same time, sears his conscience. The pain he inflicts will never be forgotten, and the debtor, and all who see his suffering, will pay their debts from that point forward. This is not far from a distinctly American theological tradition, where a sin-sick world with sin-sick souls owe debts to their God. In sinning, they've broken a contract, and the debt must be repaid. They must pay it with their flesh. This song was sung on the tail end of the long 19th century. The survivors of the Lash sang it, and they will continue to sing it through the coming Great Depression. If slavery was punishing, the hunger and disrespect that followed slavery was nearly as bad. Miss Simone's version was like the one our great-grandmothers and great-aunts sang. It was a song of fire and smoke, strummed on bass guitars and well-tuned pianos, but the hand clap was reminiscent of the washboard and her moans of red lines, cotton thorns, and slum clearance. The Sinner Man runs and hides on earth. His punishment comes from this world, not the moon, not from space. It comes from the southern horrors that Ida B. Wells famously chronicled, and the long trek north, and the crack of the police baton in Harlem and Bronzeville and Black Bottom in Detroit that followed. It is the sting of eviction and unsolved rapes and murders. It is the experience of unemployment and hunger, all while hearing from preachers and politicians and social scientists and the do-gooders that move in and out of your neighborhoods with their surveys and their cameras and their best intentions in tow, that it's really all your fault. Your refusal to snitch, or to keep a man happy, or to raise your children, or to delay gratification, or to shake off the deficits of your culture. That's what put you in this position. It's your, quote, social disorganization. It's your disbelief in the legitimacy of the law and in law enforcement. It's your legal cynicism. At the end of the day, according to these sociological concepts, according to these well-meaning sociologists, according to these do-gooder social workers, according to these criminologists who are trying to get to the bottom of your criminality, at the end of the day, the social condition in which you live is your fault. This version was recorded live at the Village Gate nightclub at the corner of Thompson and Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village in New York City. The song's protagonist is the Sinner Man, who seeks respite on Judgment Day. The song asks, "Oh, Sinner Man, where are you going to run to avoid judgment on that day?" He runs to the rock, to the river, and to the sea to ask for help. And eventually he runs to God, saying, "Please hide me Please help me, Lord. But the sinner man finds no respite. The river boils, the sea bleeds, and in the song, the rock says, I ain't gonna hide you, guy. God tells sinner man, go to the devil. Sinner man, of course, is disappointed. He says to the rock in protest, what's the matter with you, rock? Can't you see I need you? Lord, 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 on this day? But the rock speaks back. I won't hide you, he says. 3 times. I ain't gonna hide you, guy, on that day. So sinner man runs to the Lord. When the Lord refuses to respond, the sinner man says, don't you see me praying? Don't you see me seeking help? Don't you see me in the line of this agency? Can't you see I need you? Can't you see me asking for an apartment or a job to feed my family? But God responds, where were you when you should have been praying? And sends the sinner man to the devil. Sinner man goes where his God sent him and finds that the devil, his enemy, is waiting. In this parable, constructed from the traditions of the Southern Black church, the sinner man knows that the devil will never be satisfied with his torment. That is, he knows that no amount of violence that the devil inflicts on his body will ever be enough. So he cries out, power, power to the Lord, acknowledging what is a matter of fact. The fate of the sinner man is in the hands of the devil, his enemies. Simone's prophetic lyric, much like Baldwin's always timely discourses on race and the human condition, better than most capture the social situation of formerly incarcerated people who find themselves at the mercy of others, but rarely find mercy. If we stop for a minute and think about how we think about them, we would admit that we view incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people as pathology and dependence and deficiency and laziness and danger and amorality in the flesh. We see the so-called criminal as all that is wrong in the world, and we treat them this way. For the formerly incarcerated, living in the post-civil rights era, there are few, if any, open doors in the labor market, in housing, or even within their families. And just like the sinner man's confession of power, when confronted with the power of his adversary, the devil, the admission of legal guilt is brought about through rejection and exclusion, not through fact-finding, not through deep introspection, but by the power and force and weight of the crime control apparatus that comes down upon them and their families. The river boils, the sea bleeds, and the rock and God reject the sinner man. While social service agencies have waiting lists, affordable housing options are scarce, and employers, landlords, and their family members reject the sinner at every turn. This is in part due to the proliferation of electronic background checks. The advent of what sociologist Sarah Lagerson has theorized as a kind of digital punishment, and what the sociologist Susila Gurusamy has described as the carceral web, where Experian alerts don't come through our emails and text messages when there's a data breach, or when our information has been sold to Cambridge Analytica in the United States, but when a so-called sex offender moves a few miles from our home, or when someone on a violent offender registry moves into our neighborhood. What's worse, their confession does not absolve them from sin, but it instead brands them. It's a digital scarlet letter marking the conventional citizen as a criminal for life and sentencing them to punishment for a lifetime. Hence Simone's lyric, the devil is waiting. But to more fully capture what life is like under these conditions, we must turn away from our impulse to focus on the violence apparent in the archives that are at our disposal. Put differently, while we must acknowledge the formal mechanisms of exclusion, if we want to know what life is like for the wretched of the earth, and to more fully theorize social life in the era of what Fergus McNeil with Crystal Bands aptly termed mass supervision, we must follow Hartman and try to encounter the wretched in a state of freedom, or at least in the moments of freedom they manage to steal away under the suffocating realities and everyday violence emblematic of the carceral condition. That is, we must map the contours of their increasingly supervised life and note how social and formal legal controls constrain their lives. But if we want to better understand the worlds in which they inhabit, we must look at the informal mechanisms that shape the everyday life of formerly incarcerated people. We must turn away from prisons, the courts, the law, and the police, If we're to see how laws and police and prisons and court practices get taken up outside the formal criminal legal system in everyday life, that is, we must move beyond and look outside the criminal justice system if we're to grasp its full weight and scale. We must observe how the subjects of crime control make life for themselves, despite the conditions in which they live, if we ever want to fully understand the consequences of crime control in their lives. But to do this, we have to rethink about the problem. We have to reimagine the problem. Let's first examine the contours. We live in strange and marvelous times. Just a few years ago, a sitting US president, for the first time, used the words mass incarceration. Now, of course, mass incarceration was coined in the late 90s, 1999, to describe the scale and targeted incarceration of social groups that we incarcerate at such a high scale, and the thrust of incarceration is so targeted at a particular group, in this case, poor Black men, that we no longer arrest individuals in the United States. Now incarceration is a group thing. And so a sitting president of the United States for the first time used the term mass incarceration, coming out against it, going as far as to visit a federal penitentiary. This had never happened. A sitting president never visited a prison. And then we got a new reemergence of law and order rhetoric and a new commitment to law and order from the very next president, who just got out of, we know he was just voted out of office, and will concede. He may never concede, but he'll need to leave. And this, of course, for people who study mass incarceration in the United States, is a very familiar graph. It's one of the most famous graphs available, and it tracks the 27-year expansion of the US prison population. So beginning in 1972, every year for 27 straight years, we know that the number of people incarcerated in the United States increased, and we know that the rate of incarceration increased 27 straight years, exploding, going from a few 100,000 people in 1972 to over 2.3 million people today. Where we are today. There was a modest decline beginning in 2009. We can have some discussions about that. I don't think it portends to some new era of decarceration. This is my position. And we know that race and mass incarceration, we know that the deep racial disparities in relation to mass incarceration, and this is why it's called mass incarceration, because it's the targeting of social groups. But we know that Black Americans, for example, are twice as likely to be arrested, 5 times more likely to be incarcerated, serve lengthier sentences when incarcerated, are more likely to serve mandatory sentences from what are called mandatory minimum sentences. And their criminal justice contact is disproportionate with reported crimes. And this is as compared to their white counterparts who committed the same or similar crimes. So in every instance, Black Americans are overrepresented, but in every instance, people at the margins are overrepresented in US jails and prisons, and in fact, in prisons around the world. But a focus on prisons and the police, while important, leaves a curious and equally historic phenomenon hidden in plain sight. The rise of what I've called a supervised society, and what Fergus, McNeil, and company have termed mass supervision has transformed the life worlds of the poor. But to understand it, we have to rethink the scope of the problem. So let's put the prison in its place. This is a bar graph of currently incarcerated people. We know that 2.3 million people in the United States who are currently incarcerated, but we know that that figure is eclipsed by the number of people who are currently under some form of correctional supervision, formal sanctions through, for example, probation and parole services. We know that in the United States that there fluctuate, there's somewhere between, in any given year in the last decade, there have been somewhere between 4.4, 4.5 million people, 4.7, 4.8 million people. So roughly 5 million people, roughly the number of people on probation or parole services is roughly twice the size of American jails and prisons. Probation and parole is just starting to get serious attention, or at least in the last 5 to 10 years has gotten serious attention, I feel like, from scholars in the United States, because people have paid so much attention to mass incarceration. But even this figure is eclipsed by the number of people who are held in an American jail or processed through an American jail in a given year. Now, what we've done is we shift the unit of analysis from a point in time count to the number of people processed in a given year, which in some ways is unfair. But if we look at this, if we look at the number of people who are processed through a given institution, the relationship remains the same. Something like 600,000 people are admitted and released from prisons in the United States every year. And it's because of sentencing practices that there's something like 2.3 million people altogether in the point in time count. So if we think about the number of people who pass through a system in a given year, the relationship really holds. 500,000 or 600,000 people in comparison to 12 million people, close to 12 million people each year processed through local county jail systems. But even this figure is eclipsed by the number of people estimated to be alive with a felony record. So again, we shifted the unit of analysis, but to give you some sense of scale, 19.6 million people are estimated to be alive in the United States who have felony records. 19.6 million people, a population 10 times the size of the American prison system, the American jail and prison system, in fact. But even this figure is eclipsed yet again by the number of people with criminal records in the United States. 79 million Americans are estimated to have a criminal record. And this isn't just a Black problem. You know, we can talk about this quite a bit, and we will, but we know that recent studies from a study from 2016, for example, found that 39% of all white men will be arrested by their 23rd birthday for a non-traffic violation, meaning something a little more serious than just a traffic stop. That nearly 40% of white men will be arrested. So what we see when we take this into consideration is something like a supervised society. That people under correctional control are managed across multiple sites, not just the prison, and by multiple actors that exceed far beyond the prison. The community is where the action is, and that the prison, despite its place in the public imagination, is just one relatively small slice of a much larger carceral network. So we have to rethink what we mean when we talk about any of this, but especially when we talk about questions of, for example, recidivism, or the revolving door of jails and prisons. There was a 2014 Bureau of Statistics report that tracked 400,000 prisoners who were released across 30 states between 2005 and 2010, and they found that up to nearly 80% of the folks who were released during that time were rearrested. And while it's striking that over half of them were rearrested quickly, and in short order, nearly a third within just 6 months, and that their convictions were stacked, that most people who had been rearrested had on average 4.9 convictions, meaning they were charged with multiple crimes, which we can have a discussion about what that means. But what's striking to me is almost half that sample, about 44% of that sample, have been arrested 10 times or more. What does it mean to be arrested 10 times in a 5-year period? What does it mean to experience constant incarceration and release and rearrest? What does it mean for that to be the case for so many people? I believe it fundamentally alters the nature of social life in the American city, but not just in the United States, and we'll talk about this. But to understand this, to understand what it does, how it shapes the social, you have to get close. It requires a radical doubt of even the well-meaning narratives that are told about crime and punishment in a given location, and a radical doubt of even the kinds of things we count when we pay attention. But it also requires a persistent commitment to proximity, to get close and to stay close. So my question, I think that we live in a supervised society. What does it mean? What is it like to live there? What is it like to experience it? What does it mean on a day-to-day basis? My work has been what I call a political ethnography of mass incarceration's afterlife. And I've done this work in Chicago and Detroit, New York, and a number of cities that Fergus mentioned in the introduction. But I want to give you a sense of something like the more national picture for a second before we draw in. This is a screenshot of the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of a Criminal Conviction. I took this screenshot probably in 2015. And this is there's a website curated by the American Bar Association. And what it does is it counts what are called the collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. And these are the formal laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target people with criminal records in my country, in the United States. And what they found is that there are over 45,000 of them, which is striking. But the devil's always in the details. All politics are local. In the state of Michigan, where I did field work, largely based in and around Detroit, there were 789 unique laws, administrative sanctions, and regulations. In New York State, there were 1,300. In my home state of Illinois, there are 1,463 unique laws, administrative sanctions, and regulations. These include 583 laws and policies that limit the acquisition of business licenses and property rights, 556 that target employment, 186 that limit political and civic participation, which boards you can sit on, whether or not you can hold public office, how you might go about changing the laws and policies that hem you in. 54 specific laws constrain family and domestic rights, dictating whether or not you can live at home with your own children, or whether you can be in a house with anyone's children at all. 21 laws dictate access to housing, which is striking because we have national guidelines for our what we call the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And for decades and decades, there were just 2 restrictions on people with criminal records at the federal level. So the federal level issued guidelines, how you should treat people with criminal records, who you should restrict. And they said restrict people who've been charged with sex crimes and restrict people who've been charged with methamphetamine production. And that's been the case for decades, literally. Despite there just being 2, almost every major housing scheme in every major city in the United States has interpreted this as a broad-based ban on people with felony convictions. The evidence of this are the many experiments to allow people with felony records to live in public housing in the United States. So it's not just in Europe. I mean, it's not just in the United States. We also see this in Europe. Of course, Fergus McNeil and Crystal Bain's masterful work on mass supervision in Europe, his most recent book on what he calls pervasive punishment that details the many ways in which these sanctions make their way into community, all in and through all of community life. In fact, forcing us to think more carefully, not just about the role of punishment and society, but the role of punishment in society, the constitutive nature of punishment in the social world. But what does this mean? Jumping back to the United States. This means in most states, you can't hold public office. In the state of Illinois, up until about 2 years ago, you couldn't be a dog groomer, couldn't become a barber. You may not adopt or foster children. You may have to give up your parental rights. You may not live in public housing. Your job applications may be denied on the whim of an employer. You may be fired or evicted on the whim of a landlord. Your relationships with almost everyone you encounter have been fundamentally altered. So what does this look like in real time? To get there, I want to take you into the life, the curious life of a man I call Jimmy Caldwell. Jimmy is a short and affable African-American man in his mid-40s whom I met at the Detroit Reentry Center, a correctional facility that offers residential drug treatment and violence prevention services in the city of Detroit. Jimmy was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in his late 20s and struggled for 2 decades with crack and heroin addiction. A mental health technician at the prison took him off his medications during prison intake, explaining to him, "You have a drug problem, not a mental illness." Jimmy spent 8 years in a Michigan penitentiary without access to drug treatment or counseling before he paroled to the Detroit Reentry Center. After doing 6 of his 18 months in a drug treatment program, he was released on the condition that he do the following. He must report to his officer for weekly drug tests. He must regularly attend Narcotics Anonymous group meetings. He must complete workforce development training programming, and he must get a job. A generally happy man, Jimmy would break into sullen moods. He would cry during his meetings with his parole officer and break into tears during our interview sessions. Fortunately, he had a perceptive parole officer who told him to get a psychiatric evaluation at a mental health clinic. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, put back on his psychotropic medications, in order to attend counseling sessions twice a month. I met Jimmy at the Rosa Parks Transit Center, the city's main bus line, and shadowed him during his first appointment with Workforce Development. It was February of 2014, on one of the coldest days of the year. Jimmy was underdressed. He wore a black Detroit Tigers baseball jacket and a thin-worn skull cap. The address was just under a mile from the terminal, so we decided to walk. He was overly concerned with my level of comfort, cracking jokes while we walked to the Family Social Service Center, trying to put me at ease. He told me no less than 5 times that he, quote, appreciated spending time with a brother like you, and that he was glad to, quote, do something positive. When we got to the address, a gray stone monstrosity not far from Midtown, I understood in a much deeper way why he went through those motions. The building was closed. The loose leaf printout taped to the door had addresses for a few, hopefully open, workforce development agencies, but the closest one was a full 9 miles away. Ironically, that center was close to the property Jimmy was helping to rehab, the same place he slept at night. This is because he did off-the-books demolition work and cleaned newly rehabbed homes for a real estate developer that used to be his dope dealer. There was no phone number on the printout for the agency we needed to go to, and Jimmy's phone had run out of minutes anyway. He couldn't have called the number if there was one. I should say, I don't know if this was the case in the United States, but in the early 2000s, you could buy a cheap cell phone that had a number of preset minutes on it. So you could buy 50 minutes or 100 minutes or 180 minutes or 300 minutes. You buy the minutes in packages up to about 1,500, 2,000, depending on how much money you had. And Jimmy's phone, his cell phone, had run out of minutes at this point. The bus card that I gave him at our last interview had run out, and he was counting on a new bus card for me to get around for the week, and a $40 Visa gift card that I passed out as compensation for our interviews to eat and refill his prepaid phone card. He also thought he could have gotten a bus card from the center if it was open, but it was not. And a bus card is a pass that you show when you get on the bus. It allows you it basically is prepaid bus fare, so you don't have to pay each time you get on the bus. If I wasn't with Jimmy, he would have had to have walked the 9 miles, which I think I'm estimating is about 15 kilometers, to the center, or risk missing his appointment. Without the bus card I handed out, he would have to walk miles to the parole office for his weekly drug tests, to his AA meetings or counseling, or he would have to convince someone he knew with a car to give him a ride. He told me that he could be sent back to prison for missing an appointment, and his fears were far from unfounded. Not only did he know men who had been, quote, flopped, that is, sent back to prison for similar reasons, nearly a quarter of all prison admissions last year were for parole violations in the United States, but the price of violation is steep. People who get flopped have to finish their sentences, and Jimmy had 18 months left on his. Even if a parole officer didn't think that the violation was serious enough to detain him, they could still, or send you back to prison, they could still detain you for up to 90 days at the Detroit Detention Center in a unit for parole violators that they call the, quote, I-drop. Corrections officers would talk about the I-drop as a place where you, quote, lay down offenders. Jimmy's careful work to ensure that I was comfortable paid off. We walked back to the bus depot where my car was parked, and I gave him a ride, largely because he needed to, but also because I was convinced that Jimmy was a nice guy in a bad situation. When we got to the Workforce Development Center, we learned that the training classes were full, unfortunately. He could not participate. There was simply no space in the class for him. He was told to put his name on a waiting list and come back next week in case a parolee failed to show up. They did not give out bus cards to people who were not yet in the program, and they could not guarantee him a spot in the next class. We chatted with the service provider about the opportunities available at the center, grabbed brochures, and left. We then drove to Oconee Island. This is a Detroit diner chain near his work site and temporary home to debrief on the day's activities. He thanked me profusely for the $7 lunch that I bought him, for the $40 gift card, and for being there for him. There were so few places that Jimmy could turn to for help that he had to cultivate my trust. Like the center man, his life moved from one rejection to another. The mental health worker refused him psychiatric care. The social service agency shut its doors. His only option was nearly impossible to get to without help. Remember, it was about 15 kilometers away. And without me, he may not have made the appointments his parole officer required of him. But even with my help, when we got there, the agency had no space. He was put on a waiting list. They could not accommodate his needs. All of this would have to be explained to his parole officer, who may or may not believe him. And without his former dope dealer, Jimmy wouldn't even have had a place to live. And homelessness in the United States is a violation of parole because you must have an address to parole to, an address where the parole officer can visit. And by the way, having no phone is a violation of parole. The parole officer must be able to contact you at all times. Jimmy, like the center man, is almost completely at the mercy of others, dependent on the kindness of strangers for food, clothes, and shelter, and on the mercy of the police, the courts, probation and parole officers to stay out of jail or prison. And if I was honest with you, if I told you the truth, I would tell you that I didn't give Jimmy a ride 15 kilometers away at least from where we were because he was a nice guy in a bad situation. I gave him a ride because I was cold. It was February. It was Detroit. It was the coldest day of the year. I gave him a ride because I felt like it. This brings us to something of the point. In an era of what McNeil calls mass supervision, and in this highly regulated social world, this alternate legal reality that we've constructed around and about formerly incarcerated people, where 45,000 laws and policies not only constrain their ability to fully participate in the political economy and culture of the city, but where they can be compelled by law to do things that other Americans would do as voluntary. Go to drug treatment, attend therapy, do services. In this social world, we've created a world in which third-party actors have immense power over their lives. Employers, landlords, criminal justice actors and agencies, licensing bodies and government officials, even family members, social service providers, almost everyone they come in contact with now has immense power over their lives. This is because of interpretation of liability law since the 1980s, which makes helping a formerly incarcerated person risky for the well-meaning helper. Because of changes in housing policy, which say people with criminal records may not live on the premises of public housing, and because of the way that got taken up in the private market, landlords now have a legal and constitutional right to evict family members that house formerly incarcerated people, whether they live in public housing or the private rental market. Besides, good landlords are expected to keep criminals at bay, to refuse housing to people with criminal records. There's also the informal stuff, which relates to the fatigue of people who care for folks they deem able-bodied. But these same able-bodied people in my hometown of Chicago face 583 discrete laws that limit which jobs they can take, under what circumstances, and where. Employers, landlords, and social service agencies have also been made responsible through changes in liability law for what people with criminal records do. So a social service agency can lose its licensure in the United States if it provides care for someone, for example, on a sexual or violence offense registry. It can lose its insurance. landlords can and have been sued, not only for not kicking out people with criminal records when they learn that they're there, or for any crimes that happen on the premises, but for keeping their premises in ways that promote, quote, criminogenic behaviors. So when lights are out, or when it's dark in a certain alleyway, or when it's unclean, landlords have been sued. And the rationale has been in the courts that the housing conditions promote criminal behavior. The landlord has a responsibility in this case to become a crime fighter. But the stakes are even higher for people with criminal records, because this level of legal exclusion makes them at once dependent on others and among the least desirable candidates to help. This is a largely unaccounted for vulnerability, where an argument with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, a partner, could equal a bout with street homelessness because they have nowhere else to go. A problem with a coworker could equal the loss of a scarce work opportunity because there's nowhere else they can work. A missed appointment or pissing hot, and you could piss hot, meaning you fail a drug test. You could fail a drug test for drinking alcohol, by the way, could equal a trip back to prison. A misunderstanding with a case manager, a social worker, or someone at a social service agency who's charged with providing you care, because of the constraints and the scarcity, the absolute scarcity of resources, could equal the loss of a job or food or transportation, drug treatment, access to counseling, or even time with your family.
Ruben, Fergus here, just cutting in to say 5 minutes, okay?
Thank you. We've created what I call an economy of favors. This is a new catalog of disaster that fundamentally changes the nature of everyday interactions, where third parties have incredible leverage through the power of legal exclusion over the lives of formerly incarcerated people, and relationships are now asymmetrical. Exchanges of everyday resources, like renting an apartment or work or opportunities to work at a job, are now considered a favor because the employer, the landlord, the grandmother, the girlfriend is going out of their way to help you. They risk their own necks to help you. This new social arrangement has life or death consequences. It has fundamentally altered the nature of social life. So I'll just tell you about how this shows up in Jimmy's life. He stays away from his mother, Ruth, because he knows she wants to help him. He has no place to stay, not that stable. And his mother has told him several times that he can sleep on her couch, but Ruth's landlord has told Ruth that he will evict her. So Jimmy stays away from the person who loves him most because she wants to help him. His sister holds this over his head. His sister tells him, "You keep putting our mother in jeopardy, you're about to get our mother put out of the place," and calls him a loser and talks about him in front of company. His partner, Cynthia, this is a woman that he no longer wanted to be with. He met her in prison, and she was older than he wanted to be he didn't want to be in a relationship with an older woman. He said he, quote, wanted a hot girl, but he stayed with her because he had nowhere else to live. The economy of favors alters the nature of social life in the American city. It creates a power imbalance and shapes even the most intimate of social relations. The law and policy is gotten in between us. So if I look from above, I'm going to see mass incarceration. I'm going to see jail and prison expansion. I might focus on things like the franchise voting rights. I might think about employment outcomes or recidivism rates. I might worry about the day's political wins. But when I look from below, I see a supervised society. I see a transformed social life. I see an entire economy of favors. I, in fact, see a new kind of citizenship. I see unique laws, restrictions, rights, and responsibilities that target people with criminal records, where they're made to do things that other people don't have to do. They're not protected in ways that every other American is protected. And they have access to some things in some cases that other people don't, like housing resources and things like that. We can have a conversation about this. This is not simply second-class citizenship. This is not a constitutional contradiction, because in this framework, discrimination is perfectly legal. We've created a new citizenship tract. We've created something I call carceral citizenship. And the question for us is, what does it say about the state and nature of our democracy? This is a matter of citizenship and not behavior. And because of this, you can't treat your way out of it. You can't improve police-community relations. That won't do it, though that's important. Implicit bias doesn't get at a problem of citizenship. We have to think about interventions at the level of citizenship if we ever want to get free. I think this means advocating for law and policy changes that reimagine justice. The uprisings that we see are forcing us across the world now. The uprisings across the world are forcing us to reimagine what we mean by justice, to rethink what the appropriate role of crime control is in the lives of people and what it should be, whether or not we need prisons at all, in fact. Remember that communities where the action is, and that we have to provide a bridge to resources. We have impoverished millions of people across the United States, and we see the extension of some of these things into European cities. We have to create bridges to resources and promote the intrinsic humanity of people with records. But mostly, we have to shift perceptions of crime and criminals. We have to allow ourselves to get close. We have to commit to persistent proximity. I think we live in strange times. Were we to set every prisoner free, we'd still have a supervised society. I've tried to ask different questions. I've tried to attend to different theoretical considerations, moving outside the discourse of power to see who and under what circumstances are deeply impacted by these things that we've discussed today. And I've tried to attend to different empirical questions to move beyond the limits of our archive. But the question before us isn't an empirical or theoretical one, it's an ethical one. We live in a supervised society, but what kind of society do we want? Thank you.
Thanks, Ruben. That was fantastic. And I know from the comments and questions that have been coming in that other people have also found it just as stimulating and challenging as I have. There are already lots of really good questions, and I can maybe say to people attending, if you want to look at the questions in the Q&A, there's a little thumbs up beside each question. And if you click on that thumbs up, if you want that question to be prioritized, then that'll help me when we get there in a few minutes to pick out the questions that are of most interest to most people. So have a look. While you do that, I hope you can multitask and listen to Marguerite as she provides her response to Ruben's lecture. Over to you, Marguerite.
I did the classic unmute. There you go. Thank you, Fergus, and thank you, Ruben, for such a powerful talk. And the way that you highlight these injustices in the criminal justice system in the United States, and especially Chicago. I know that there's more international questions on the Q&A, which I think are very valuable and also highlight Alistair's point that we're not only Scottish, but I guess what I'm going to do here is draw on my research and discussions I've had here to see how this situation might apply in Scotland. So obviously the racial dimension is very different in Scotland. Not that there's no racism in Scotland, and some of my colleagues have written about that, but it's 97% white, and that's reflected in the criminal justice system. And our incarceration is not as massive, although we think it's way too big. And there's not as many laws after incarceration or convictions as the ones that you pointed out there. But maybe even so, the way that disclosure works in Scotland, and any employer can find out if anybody's had any kind of prison sentences or more serious convictions for the rest of their lives, kind of leads to the same result where people don't get jobs, generally after a more serious offense or a series of offenses. In the book, you also write really specifically and really beautifully, I thought, about Detroit and its deindustrialization and the abandonment of that city with the loss of jobs and the influx of Black people there. And in Scotland, I think, rather than the more historical and deep-seated kind of racial injustice, we have a situation that's more similar than to that, where people in prison and under the supervision of the criminal justice system in any way or form are overwhelmingly from areas that score the highest on the Scottish Multiple Index of Deprivation. And these are also kind of areas that have been abandoned. And your quote from James Baldwin about the shock of first seeing a white face really resonated with something I've read by Darren McGarvey in his book Poverty Safari, where he describes he's from an area of a lot of deprivation, and his shock of seeing the West End of Glasgow for the first time and how people behave there and how they walk there and what it even looked like in the street is maybe similar to that. And the extent to which the areas that people come from who end up in prison are abandoned is kind of highlighted in my research and in other people's research by the way that prison becomes sought or not avoided as a provider of housing or drug rehab for people who feel themselves sliding back into addiction or find themselves on the street and say, I'd rather be in prison and offend on purpose, or do not evade arrest, do not try very hard not to be arrested. But here too, they are very much blamed for their social conditions. So it is all put on the individual. And we talked about that today in the health panel earlier in the mini conference we had, how people are rejected from the beginning and then are kind of subjected to the slow violence, this is Sarah Armstrong's term, of incarceration and the lack of healthcare in these prisons, but then also the impact of these environments themselves and how that follows people out. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Scotland, we have a record number of drug deaths in Europe, like very, very, very much higher than anywhere else, which is partly a product of the drug epidemic, but like that's now coming to the point where people are dying. So one thing that I think is really interesting in your book, and especially in your talk as well, is like you give this really eloquent account of marginalization and racial injustice, but then when you talk to Jimmy, he still blames himself, and his family still seems to blame him for his circumstances as well, right? So one of the questions I have, and we see that in Scotland too, and one of the questions we have is, how do we get a broader recognition of this injustice throughout society? And in the United States, you might be a little bit ahead of us there in that you do have social movements like Black Lives Matter, and you have documentaries like The 13th, and now you have this book. And I think we're a little bit further behind there, but that those shifting perceptions are really, really important. And thank you.
Thanks, Marguerite. Ruben, if you'd like to respond to Marguerite, feel free, but we need to do that very swiftly because we have a huge number of really interesting questions. So do you want to quickly come back to Marguerite?
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, one, thank you so much for engaging the book and your close read of it. I just appreciate that so much. And I hope that we'll have interlocutors from Scotland, because one of my interests, like one of the reasons why I came to Glasgow to do field work, was because of some of the deep similarities. I mean, things like the so-called Glasgow effect, the fact that like the health and well-being of people from Glasgow is so fundamentally different from, depending on postal codes and this kind of thing. It's so fundamentally different based on postal codes. And we see similar things in the United States where life expectancy, for example, drops close to 20 years within a 2 mile, within a 2 mile distance. It drops 20 years, which is just striking. And also the kinds of cultural, the ways that cultural forms, the concentration of disadvantage in just a few postal codes and a few housing schemes, and the ways that we talk about youth culture, for example, and drug culture in Glasgow, in many ways mirrors the way that we talked about the so-called urban underclass in the United States. This idea that there are problems in the family form, that there are cultural expressions that have popped up among and out of this kind of chronic disadvantage that creates this hard nut to crack. And also like the depictions of poor Glaswegians if that's the way to talk about people from Glasgow, in movies, is in my mind is strikingly similar. Not being able to understand the dialect, looking at tracksuits, like these kinds of stereotypical representations of poor people from Glasgow look very much like the stereotypical representations. They're not the same, but they look very much like the stereotypical because there's something about marginality that creates a through line between these things, and the ways and this is also part and parcel of how and why people blame themselves when they're facing structural conditions, because on some level there's some fact. Fergus asked me to be brief. I'll wrap up, I promise. but it's in some ways there's some fact in the idea that agency is required to muscle yourself out of a terrible situation. You know, your father did have an alcohol problem. He did go to prison. He did serve 20 years for murder, as some of the brothers and sisters in one of the faith-based agencies that I got a chance to sit in Glasgow talked to me about. We had focus groups, and they would talk to me about, well, my dad was convicted of murder, and the infamy of his actions followed me, and it rested on me. And then I turned to drink. I turned to drugs. I made decisions in my life. I got into bar fights. I. So there's something about the agency, and there's something powerful about them owning their role and their lot in life. That's necessary to pull yourself out. It's necessary to have enough confidence in yourself that you think you can change your social situation. And we see that everywhere. But there's also something powerful about recognizing the social conditions that produce the need for that kind of agency, the conditions in which people are more likely, for example, to turn to drink, the kinds of deindustrialization that leave fathers out of the workplace. For Jimmy, you know, you've got a whole generation of children whose fathers were killed by the auto plants. They developed forms of cancer. The father absence wasn't because of deadbeat behavior or something like that. It's because the fathers were dead. You know, but that's so easy. It's so easy to internalize when everything around you says you're worthless. So says James Baldwin. Anyway, thank you so much for those wonderful comments.
Okay, I'm going to do my best now to dive into a few of these questions, and I think there's one cluster which is easy to pull out, and it's represented by our top question asked by Jim Watson, who asks, do you consider that President Biden and VP Harris will effect any radical change to criminal justice in the next 4 years? But I want to connect that to other comments, which are all, I think, in one way or another, looking for some hope in this story. So, for example, our colleague Milena in Edinburgh has asked, what about some changes in certain American states in relation to this re-enfranchisement of people who previously have been disenfranchised? And others maybe are kind of asking questions about the development of welfare, income security rights, other forms of public assistance, I guess, in the States. Maybe this is ridiculously optimistic, but perhaps a Democrat presidency allows the possibility of some more generous provision on the social side that can somehow begin to address some of the inequalities and injustices that you've been articulating. So the basic question is, have you any hope?
Yes. Yes, I do. I have hope for all the reasons that were mentioned. I mean, a new administration matters in interesting ways, but it matters for welfare policy, matters for criminal justice policy, matters for the kinds of rhetoric and language that is amped up a kind of right-wing backlash that is racist and nationalist, white nationalist sort of backlash. Backlash is the wrong word, really. A white nationalist ascendance in the United States that's been sort of like gasoline has been added to the fire. They've always been there. Gasoline has been added they've been given some fuel under the current administration, and it's clear and everybody knows it. And change in that way matters. But the thing that gives me hope isn't Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. The thing that gives me hope are the Black Lives Matter protests that have erupted across the world. The thing that gives me hope are the social movement activists that I follow in the book. So the book ends with a chapter called Power, well, it ends with a chapter called America Goddamn, which is kind of my epilogue. But before that, the actual ending of the book is a chapter called Power that follows formerly incarcerated activists who are really leading a national and now global fight to transform law and policy. And all of this work is, I think, is forcing us to think about the ways that we can re-engineer our society, reorganize our society in such a way that it makes a place for people we're afraid of. That's the crux. And so this is why we need the book, and we need 1,000 books, you know, not just mine, obviously. And we need 1,000, and we need the 13th, and we need a president who's going to have in the United States who's going to have you know, who's gonna say things that speak to the shared humanity of people. This isn't to say that racial difference doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. But you know, it matters for our sense of pride in who we are and where we live, in the same way that there are national differences. And the thing with someone from Scotland is different from someone from Ireland. You know, like that kind of thing. But we know that this is fake, that these are lines that we've drawn arbitrarily, and we need to push back against the essentialized narrative of racial difference, narratives of racial difference that essentialize characteristics. And so when I think about these poor people from Glasgow, you know, from the early, you know, we need to move away from narratives that locate their problems in their culture. There will be problems that come from adaptations to social issues, of course. Of course, I can make mistakes in my lifetime, and of course, I can teach my son to make those same mistakes. Of course, I can. That's obvious, right? But we need to keep our eye on structure. Like in what ways have we engineered society to produce those 3 or 4 postal codes from which we arrest everybody? Like that. Like that's the question. And why does everybody we arrest come from these 4 or 5 places? This is the question before us, and people are pushing us to think in a more nuanced way, and that's where I gain hope.
So a related kind of theme which is coming out in the questions that Andrew Jefferson actually starts here, one of the first questions we received, which was to ask you to articulate or elaborate on how you're using the concept of afterlives here, and the reason it relates to what you've just said is that the remedy, if you like, or the response to the problem depends on the way in which you're conceptualizing afterlives, the reverberations that you've been discussing. So can you say a little bit more about what you mean by afterlives and how that relates to the question of, I guess, you know, we could broaden it out to talk about defunding the police, abolitionist movements, transformative justice movements. How does the remedy respond to the analysis in relation specifically to the concept of afterlives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for that question. I am inspired by the work of Saidiya Hartman, who writes about what she calls the afterlife of slavery, and in a book called Lose Your Mother, she defines the afterlife of slavery as poverty, incarceration, and premature death. And so what I think she's looking at are the traces of the remnants, how slavery carries on into the social world, the many ways that happens. Okay, and I'm also inspired by Walter Benjamin's use of afterlife in his famous article, The Task of the Translator, when he talks about the afterlife of art. And a part of the afterlife of art is fame, you know, so like fame, and maybe we could think about fame and infamy, and maybe infamy might be a better a better way to think about the afterlife. So these are kind of the collective memory of a thing, and the way and the resonance of a set of practices and the ways that they show up in the social world. Well, for me, there's also a spiritual dimension to this. And when I think about the afterlife, I think about this in a very Judeo-Christian sense, in that the afterlife locates us within a cosmos. It situates us within a cosmic order. Now, let's get rid of the cosmos for people who don't get down like that. It locates us within a social order. It identifies who we are. The afterlife places us, and it places us both in a category, kinds of people who make it to a certain place, but it also places us there because of actions. So the afterlife in this way individualizes while it universalizes. The afterlife can be very destructive, obviously. And so I'm looking at the way that we've hyper individualized at the same time universalized the criminal and the idea of the criminal. And it deeply relates to how we think about race, racial categorization, but how we think about class, which was also essentialized in very interesting ways before we got racial frameworks, before we got the racial frameworks that we have. Class, of course, is a social relation. It's not just an, I mean, I'm speaking to the choir. It's not just an economic position. It's a social relation. It's a social relation that categorizes as it individualizes. So there's a moral dimension to this. And so the way out is to break it. It's to break the afterlife. It's to look at the moral dimension of it, to look at the many ways that we've individualized what is actually a categorical mistake, a categorical problem, a problem of categorizing.
This takes us to another question, and I'm connecting a couple here from Andrew Henley and Ben. I'm not sure if it's Mackey or Mackay, so apologies for the pronunciation. And both are kind of picking up on aspects of the way that you're describing the supervised society, and also how the economy of favors disperses punishment, or indeed makes it pervasive. But both are also kind of indirectly asking the question, what is it that the state must do differently, and what is it that must be done differently in civil society? And I know, because I've read your work, that one of your first papers was about the devolution of responsibility for re-entry to impoverished communities of color in the States. And I remember coming back from that first trip in Chicago with you in the car, angry at the kind of dereliction of duty by the state, and raging about that for a while, but then being confronted by someone else with the question, Fergus, would you want to live in a state that had the power to integrate you? And thinking, God, that is a good question. So I think some of these questions in the chat are asking, how do you think about the relationship between and the responsibilities of the state for enabling re-entry and the responsibilities of civil society and the community? I'm going to come to the family in the next and probably the final question. But first of all, state, civil society and re-entry, how do you see the connections?
Right, well, I've argued that the state relies on civil society and families to do work that the state used to, at least rhetorically, claim as its turf. So the rehabilitation in that case of incarcerated people has been pushed out onto private actors. This is a form of privatization that I felt like at the time, and still feel like we weren't paying enough attention to. The conceptual terrain has been ceded, and the physical terrain has been ceded. So that rehabilitation, the responsibility to make sure that people have a place in the world is after incarceration is put squarely on the shoulders of church community groups and nonprofit organizations or something like that, without providing the kinds of resources that these groups need to do anything remotely like the necessary work that's there. And I think the state has a dual role. I think the state, on the one hand, needs to not exclude. This is so on the one hand, the state could take a position. I think I got this from you, actually. Do no harm. Did you? Right? So well, okay, I don't know. Like some conversation. So on the one hand, the state could take a doctor's position, a physician's position. It could start from the place of not doing harm. Let's start there. That's a rule. You know, you can't make matters worse. And the way the state does harm are through in the United States are through the 45,000 laws, policies, and sanctions. So it needs to roll all that back. And then the second, it could think about ways to help bolster the ability of civil society to respond to the needs of community. And so that could mean funding organizations in a particular kind of way. It could mean investing in education. See, so like the decriminalization, for example, of Black life includes providing robust educational, housing, healthcare, resources, making sure that it's adequate. So that the decriminalization of Black life means necessarily an expansion of support so that Black life can thrive, like all other kinds of life in the United States. And so I think I see states as having a role to provide that. There's a reason why the US always looks to Europe on questions of penology. We look to you all because you have a more robust welfare state that prevents lots of what we see here. But the tendencies to discriminate are the same. And so therein lies the danger. You know, if I'm arresting these folks from this postal code, I have to ask myself, in what ways am I doing harm? And in what ways might I support? So anyway, I don't know if that's a dodge. I don't think so. I think it's a direct answer, but that's my answer.
Okay, I think this is going to have to be the last question, and just to leave a few minutes for the necessary thank yous at the end. And I'm picking up on something which has been raised here by Una Barr, whose book, Desisting Sisters, by the way, if you haven't read, you should read. She thanks you for a brilliant talk. And then says, the three women in Jimmy's life were really interesting to me, to Una. In particular, in the traditional desistance literature, women are seen as being responsible for helping criminalized men repair social bonds to conventional life as a result of patriarchal notions around women's caring nature and caring roles. Was this the case in Jimmy's life? How did the women deal with their responsibilization for his situation?
Yeah, I mean, so for his mother, it caused great concern because she absolutely wanted to provide care. And you're right, because of these patriarchal notions of what it means, for example, to be a woman, but also our understanding of family and what it means to be a mother. And so the mother didn't care that she would be evicted. So she pressed to have Jimmy come stay with her. And the result was Jimmy having to avoid his mother. And so this created a tension between a mother and her son. For the girlfriend, you know, there are 1,000 reasons why a woman would stay in a relationship with someone that doesn't say want them. One of which could be she doesn't know. You know, one of which could be because of the scarcity of eligible partners in a particular social arrangement. And so Jimmy is one of the millions of Black men who've been taken out of. There's a really interesting New York Times piece called "The Missing." It's about the 1.5 million missing Black men in the United States who are gone from the scene either due to incarceration or premature death. And I think this has to have something to do with I don't like to think in market terms, but you know, if there are fewer partners available, you know, like this has something to do with the ways that one relates to the people that are there. Anyway, so it's a question that requires more time, but it's a great one, and thank you for it.
And sadly, time is what we are running out of. So first of all, I want to thank everybody who put questions in the Q&A. We'll make sure that those get saved and sent on to Ruben, because there's a load of things in here that you want to see and
great.
and possibly want to respond to offline. We've got contributions from Indonesia, from Ghana, from Ireland, you know, and such interesting and rich questions. I'm sorry to everybody who I didn't manage to wrap your questions into those that I posed, but I hope you, at least some of you, recognized the things that you were raising in the way that I posed those questions to Ruben. And Ruben, thank you for trying to provide such rich answers as well. Thanks to Marguerite for the response to Ruben's talk. Thanks to Rachel for all the behind the scenes work to make all this possible, to Ali for the warm introduction, but most of all, I'm sure you'll all want to join me somehow on Zoom, whether by using your voices, or you can't do that because you're muted. I'll have to cheer and clap loudly on your behalf to say thank you so much to Ruben Miller for providing such a brilliant, inspiring talk. We're done for today, but obviously keep in touch with us, keep in touch with the Centre. You can follow developments there on the website, which is sccjr.ac.uk. You can follow us on Twitter at the SCCJR. And you should check out our new podcast series, Just Humans, which launched last week. And there'll be more of those to come over the next few weeks, and many other events coming up. So please stay in touch with us. Stay in touch with Ruben's work. Buy the book in February when it comes out. I've been lucky enough to see it in advance and to read it, and it's one of the most scholarly and thoroughly engaging accounts that combines erudition and scholarship with proximity, to use Ruben's word, through the examination of all sorts of life experiences, which Ruben has been close to in a variety of different ways. So it's a wonderful and important book, and one that I think we should all pay a lot of attention to. Thanks so much for joining us today. I think that concludes everything. So safe onward travels to whatever you're doing next. Thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye now.